For 3,000 years the galaxy lived in peace. The Great Council had brought together many different species, each one unique in body, culture, and thought. They ruled not through weapons but through words. If a dispute rose between two worlds, it was solved through long meetings, agreements, and patient dialogue. Generations grew up without ever seeing a battle. Weapons of war were put away in museums, shown only as reminders of a darker past. To most, war became a story of history, something that would never return. Humans too were part of this long peace. They had joined the council after many centuries of their own struggles on Earth. They were known as builders, healers, and thinkers. In the council chambers, humans spoke calmly, finding middle ground where others only argued. To the young species of the galaxy, humans looked no different from them, just another peaceful race that had left behind the shadow of conflict. But deep inside humanity's memory was something that never truly faded. Their history was filled with survival against storms, hunger, and endless wars on their own planet. The marks of that past were written not only in books but in the way they lived and thought. While peace lasted, humans never forgot that it could end. Most other species grew soft during those millennia. A child born on one world would grow into an adult without ever hearing of bloodshed. They did not even imagine danger, because the council had protected them for so long. To them, safety was as natural as air to breathe. But on Earth, the past was still studied with care. Teachers told students not only about art and science but also about the struggles of their ancestors. Old stories of survival were passed from one generation to another, not to glorify war, but to remind them that peace was fragile. Humans valued peace, but they never trusted it blindly. The galaxy was filled with wonders during those 3,000 years. Planets once closed off to outsiders opened their skies to visitors. Great bridges of trade connected thousands of worlds. Scientists shared discoveries freely, healers cured diseases once thought impossible, and artists inspired across the stars. Travel became easy, and cultures blended until many people felt like citizens of one grand union. The idea of war seemed as foolish as lighting fire inside a garden. Nobody wished to destroy what had been built. Yet in quiet corners of the galaxy, a question sometimes rose among human thinkers. Could peace last forever? Could every species resist greed, pride, or ambition? Humans debated this often among themselves. Some believed the galaxy had grown too wise to return to violence. Others shook their heads, saying history always repeated itself, and one day someone would rise to break the silence. But such voices were rare, and most preferred not to think of such things. Earth itself changed during the long peace. Vast cities grew among forests and oceans, balanced between nature and technology. Energy was drawn from the sun, winds, and tides. Families lived without fear, working to create instead of to fight. Music, art, and stories became just as important as machines. Children grew strong and curious, learning not only the science of the stars but also the meaning of kindness. To outsiders, Earth looked like a paradise, a place that had truly moved beyond war. But there were places on Earth where memories lived quietly. Old battlefields were kept as open grounds, not covered by cities. Museums preserved armor, ships, and weapons. Veterans of ancient struggles told their stories to any who wished to hear, though they often ended with the same warning: do not think peace will last forever. Some young humans listened with interest, others with doubt, but the words stayed in their minds. The council trusted peace fully. They even reduced their defense fleets to a handful of ceremonial ships. Their guards carried only light weapons, more for honor than for use. Most leaders believed there was no need for strength when everyone was united. They thought any who tried to harm the council would be alone and foolish. Yet this belief also made them blind. They forgot that not every world shared the same dream. To humans, the age of peace was a gift, but it was also a test. They knew in their hearts that nothing stayed the same forever. Even on Earth, Storms still came after calm skies, and floods still followed seasons of dryness. So too, peace could one day be broken. Still, they lived with quiet patience, watching, learning, and preparing in ways others could not see. 3,000 years passed like a great river flowing gently under the sun. It carried generations forward without a wave of war. To the galaxy it seemed eternal. To humans it was long, but never endless. Somewhere far beyond the Council's reach, shadows waited. Humanity did not know when or how those shadows would rise, but they carried something inside them that others did not, an unshakable memory of what it meant to face the storm. And if that storm returned, they would not meet it with fear. The silence of peace did not last forever. At the edge of the galaxy, far from the Council's center, the Dravari Empire began to rise. For thousands of years they had remained hidden, growing stronger in secret. While the other species celebrated peace, the Dravari prepared for conquest. They built warships in hidden docks, trained armies in silence, and forged weapons unlike anything the galaxy had seen in ages. They studied the Council carefully, watching as fleets were reduced, as defenses weakened, and as entire civilizations forgot the meaning of danger. To the Dravari, this was not a time of peace but a time of opportunity. Their first strike was sudden. A colony world near the edge of Council space received no warning before fire rained from the sky. The Dravari fleet destroyed its defenses in hours. Entire cities were burned, and those who survived were taken as prisoners. When the news reached the Council, leaders were shocked. They had no plan for such an attack. For centuries, every conflict had been solved through words, not weapons. Many leaders thought the Dravari could be reasoned with. They sent envoys, carrying messages of peace and negotiation. None of those envoys returned. The Dravari did not want peace. They wanted dominion. To them, the galaxy was weak, filled with species that had forgotten how to fight. They believed themselves destined to rule, and they laughed at the thought of a council that solved everything with discussion. More fleets left their hidden bases, striking new targets. Planets that had never seen war were thrown into panic. Colonies surrendered without a fight, hoping to save themselves. Entire populations, who had never held a weapon, bowed down to the Dravari rather than face destruction. Fear spread quickly. In the great chambers of the Council, representatives argued in desperation. Some demanded surrender, believing survival was more important than pride. Others begged for help, though they had no fleets to send. Most were simply lost, unable to understand how war could return after 3,000 years. For them, war was not real, only a shadow of the past. They could not act, because they had forgotten how to stand against an enemy. Among the humans, the news was met with silence. On Earth, families gathered around screens as the reports arrived. Ships burning, colonies falling, prisoners taken by the Dravari. Unlike many others, the humans did not break into panic. They did not weep as if the world had ended. Instead, they listened. They watched carefully. Inside their hearts, something old began to stir. While other species cried that peace had failed, humans remembered their own past. They had lived through centuries of storms, invasions, and endless struggles long before joining the Council. They had fought against themselves, and though it had cost them greatly, they had survived. That memory was part of them. It was carried in stories told by parents to children, in the history taught at schools, and in the quiet wisdom of the old. On the surface, Earth looked as calm as the rest of the Council. But beneath the surface, decisions were being made. Leaders met in closed chambers. Generals who had lived their lives in retirement returned to service. Old records of tactics and strategy were opened again. Hidden factories, long turned to peaceful use, began to change their purpose. Ships that had been sitting as museum pieces were inspected, repaired, and tested. Weapons once locked away were studied, upgraded, and prepared for use. humanity was not rushing into war blindly, but it was preparing with steady hands. Other species looked at the humans with confusion. Why were they not crying out for surrender? Why were they not begging the Dravari for mercy? Why did their leaders look calm instead of broken? To outsiders, it seemed strange. But among humans, there was no mystery. They knew something the others had forgotten. Peace was never permanent. It was precious, but it always carried risk. If someone rose to shatter it, then only courage could answer. When the council gathered again, most representatives were lost in fear. They argued about how many worlds would be surrendered to the Dravari, and how best to avoid further destruction. But the human voice stood out. Their representative spoke firmly, saying that peace without freedom was not peace at all. If the galaxy bent its knees to the Dravari, then everything built in 3,000 years would be meaningless. Some listened, but many shook their heads. They thought the humans reckless, too bold, too willing to fight. They did not understand why a people who had lived in peace for so long could speak with such strength. But back on Earth, the truth was clear. Humans were not smiling because they loved war. They smiled because they understood it. They smiled because they had faced storms before, and they knew they could endure again. While others saw only fear in the return of war, humans saw a test they had prepared for across centuries of memory. The Dravari continued their march, burning more worlds, enslaving more colonies. The council grew weaker each day, unable to act. Yet on Earth, lights burned in secret hangars. Engineers worked through sleepless nights. Pilots trained again, relearning maneuvers once forgotten. Families gathered, not to weep, but to tell their children, "Do not be afraid. We have survived worse." And as the galaxy trembled, humanity stood calm, waiting for the moment when they would rise. On Earth, the news of each new attack spread quickly. People saw the images of Dravari fleets tearing through colonies, burning cities, and taking entire populations as captives. The council was still arguing, still searching for words to calm the storm, but humans had stopped waiting. They gathered in halls, in schools, in homes, and in command centers. The question was no longer if the Dravari would reach them, but when. And when they came, humanity would not meet them unprepared. In cities across Earth, old veterans who had lived long enough to remember humanity's last wars began to speak again. Many had thought their voices forgotten, their lessons buried in the dust of time. But now, people came to hear them. They spoke of discipline, of courage, of sacrifice, of what it meant to stand when all seemed lost. Children listened with wide eyes, teenagers with burning hearts, and adults with a sense of steady duty. The words were not stories anymore, they were lessons. At the same time, leaders of Earth opened the archives. Hidden away were centuries of strategies, plans, and doctrines. These were not relics of a violent past, but a map for survival. Commanders studied them late into the night. Tactics that had once won against impossible odds were read aloud in council rooms. Plans for defense, for counterattack, and even for rebuilding after loss were taken out and refined. Knowledge, long preserved, now had purpose again. Factories across Earth began to change. Machines that once built farming equipment were now forging armor and plating for ships. Workshops that had been making tools for construction were redirected to produce weapons. Energy plants were expanded, producing the power needed to fuel fleets. It was not done with excitement, but with quiet determination. Workers sang as they labored, not because they enjoyed what they built, but because they knew why they built it. Every hammer strike, every piece of metal shaped, every circuit tested was an act of resistance. Pilots were called to training fields. Many were young, having flown only in peaceful skies. Others were older, carrying memories of battles long past. Together they trained, day after day, until their movements were sharp and unified. They flew in formations, practiced dangerous maneuvers, and prepared themselves for the kind of combat the galaxy had not seen in millennia. At first, mistakes were common, but slowly the skills returned. Each day brought more precision, more confidence, more strength. When the Drivari came, these pilots would not hesitate. Not only soldiers prepared. Families too made ready. Parents told their children not to be afraid, for humanity had faced darkness before. Communities strengthened their bonds, helping one another with food, shelter, and support. Artists painted images of courage, musicians played songs that lifted spirits, and storytellers reminded the people that survival was part of who they were. Humanity was not preparing for war with despair, but with a spirit that carried both hope and determination. The Council still sent messages urging calm, urging surrender, urging compromise. Many species listened, too afraid to resist. They could not imagine any path other than bending before the Drivari. But humanity listened differently. They heard the Council's fear, and it only hardened their resolve. If the galaxy could not stand, then humanity would lead. When the Drivari saw these preparations, they were amused. They believed humans were weak, like the others. They believed their fleets would crush Earth with little effort. They underestimated what it meant for a people to carry the memory of struggle in their blood. They did not understand why humans smiled when they spoke of battle. That smile was not madness, nor joy in violence. It was the calm of those who had faced storms before and learned that storms could be survived. Quietly, alliances began to form. Some smaller races, frightened but unwilling to live under the rule of the Drivari, turned to humans for guidance. They saw in them something they could not find in themselves: the will to resist. These groups sent supplies, volunteers, and information. In training fields, aliens stood beside humans, learning how to fight, how to endure, and how to hold their ground. Humanity shared its strength freely, not for conquest, but to show others that courage was possible. Days turned into weeks, and the galaxy continued to tremble under the Drivari advance. Yet on Earth, there was a different feeling in the air. It was not fear but focus. Factories glowed through the night. Training fields echoed with the roar of engines. Families worked together, bound by a single purpose. From orbit, new fleets began to rise, their hulls gleaming in the light of the sun. Ships once thought relics now soared again, improved and ready. When other races looked at humanity, they saw something strange. They saw people who prepared for war not with despair, but with a strange quiet confidence. They did not welcome the return of war, but they accepted it. They faced it. And in their eyes, in their smiles, there was a message that even the Drivari could not ignore. The age of peace was over. War had returned. And humanity was ready. The Drivari continued their march through the stars, striking world after world with terrible force. Colonies surrendered before the first shot, terrified of being burned like the ones before them. Whole civilizations bent their knees, believing it was better to live in chains than to risk destruction. In the chambers of the council, panic grew worse with each report. Representatives argued until their voices broke, but no answer came. They had no fleets to send, no armies to fight. Their only power was words, and words meant nothing to the Drivari. It was in this darkness that the humans began to call for resistance. Their representative stood in the great chamber and spoke with steady voice. "If we surrender," he said, "then all that we have built will be lost. Peace without freedom is not peace. Safety without dignity is not safety. We must stand." Many shook their heads, calling the humans reckless. Some laughed bitterly, asking what one small race could do against such power. But a few listened, and in their hearts they felt something stir. On Earth, the preparations grew larger. Fleets that had once been small became greater each day. Engineers worked without pause, turning raw metal into strong hulls. Scientists designed new shields and weapons, blending ancient designs with modern knowledge. Training grounds expanded, filled not only with humans but also with volunteers from other worlds. They came quietly, in small groups, often without the knowledge of their own governments. They came because they had seen something in humanity that gave them hope. These volunteers were not soldiers. Many were farmers, builders, or students who had never held a weapon. At first they struggled, hands trembling as they trained. But humans were patient teachers. They showed them how to move, how to aim, how to stand firm even when afraid. They spoke not only of battle but of why they fought, so that their children would not grow up as slaves, so that their worlds would remain free, so that the galaxy would not be ruled by fear. Slowly, the volunteers changed. Their movements grew sharp, their voices grew strong, and in their eyes came the same fire that burned in the humans. The Dravari did not notice these changes. They were too busy celebrating their victories, too busy mocking the weakness of the council. Their leaders believed that no power in the galaxy could resist them. They thought of the humans as foolish dreamers, preparing fleets that would soon be crushed. But while the Dravari boasted, humanity built. And while the galaxy wept, humanity trained. Within human fleets, discipline was unmatched. Commanders demanded not only skill but also unity. Every pilot learned to trust the one beside them. Every soldier knew that courage was not about ignoring fear but about standing even when fear was heavy. Mistakes were corrected, not with anger but with determination. Humanity understood that they would need every ounce of strength to face what was coming. In time, whispers spread through the stars. Rumors told of fleets gathering near Earth, of humans who smiled when they spoke of war. The stories reached frightened colonies, broken worlds, and species that had already surrendered. Many dismissed them as lies. Others clung to them like light in the dark. Some even began to hope that perhaps the galaxy was not doomed after all. Back in the council chambers, the humans pushed again for action. They offered to lead fleets, to build a united defense. The council hesitated, still lost in fear, but a few smaller voices agreed. A mining race that had lost its colonies sent raw ore. A farming world sent food to feed human workers. A scattered group of nomads sent skilled pilots, saying they would rather fight and fall free than live under chains. The alliances were small, fragile, and quiet, but they grew. To the humans, this was enough. They did not wait for all to join. They knew that in every storm, someone must take the first step. They would fight, and others would follow when they saw that resistance was possible. As fleets rose from Earth's orbit, the mood of the people changed. There was no celebration, for they knew the cost that would come. Yet there was no despair either. Families sent their loved ones to ships with tears in their eyes but pride in their hearts. Children waved flags as pilots departed. Elders blessed the young, reminding them of the courage of ancestors. Humanity had chosen its path, and it walked it with steady steps. The Dravari saw the ships and laughed. To them, it was nothing. To the galaxy, it was madness. But to those who stood close enough to see the humans preparing, it was something else. It was courage, pure and unbroken, carried like a flame through the darkness. The storm was coming closer. The Dravari fleets would soon test these new defenders. The council still hoped for mercy, but humans had stopped hoping for what would never come. They had chosen to resist, to fight, and to lead. The galaxy had forgotten the face of war, but humanity had never truly forgotten. And now, with the first allies by their side and their fleets ready, they were prepared to remind everyone. The day of the first great test arrived. Human fleets, though smaller than the enemy, gathered near the edge of a dying star system. The system had little value, only empty rocks and a fading sun, but it was chosen for a reason. If humanity lost, fewer lives would be taken. If they won, the message would echo across the galaxy. The Dravari came with overwhelming numbers. Their warships filled the dark sky, metal giants armed with heavy cannons and shields built to crush resistance. To them, it was not a battle but a demonstration. They believed the humans would break quickly, as so many others had done. Their commanders promised easy victory, their soldiers prepared for celebration, not struggle. In the human fleets, the mood was different. Pilots sat in their cockpits, faces calm but steady. Soldiers stood in waiting bays, checking gear one last time. Commanders gave orders without shouting, their voices clear and measured. Everyone knew the risk, but fear was not their master. They had trained for this moment. They carried the memory of every ancestor who had stood against the impossible. When the first shots were fired, the battle began with fire and thunder. Dravari cannons lit the void, striking against human shields. The impact shook ships to their core, yet they held together. Then the human fleets answered. Their movements were fast, sharp, and daring. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, they weaved between larger ships, striking weak points and vanishing before heavy weapons could turn. To the Dravari, it seemed chaotic. To the humans, it was discipline and precision. The smaller allied ships, crewed by volunteers from other worlds, followed the humans closely. At first they hesitated, but soon they began to trust. They copied the human maneuvers, fought with growing courage, and found strength they did not know they carried. What had begun as a weak alliance became something sharper, something stronger, something that refused to bow. The Dravari were unprepared for such resistance. They had believed the humans would crumble like the others. Instead, they saw fleets that laughed at danger, soldiers who boarded enemy ships with fierce determination, and commanders who turned even defeat into traps. On one vessel, a small human team broke into a Dravari cruiser, fighting through narrow halls until they reached the control center. The ship fell silent, then turned its weapons on its former allies. Such acts spread confusion among the Dravari lines. Still, the cost was heavy. Human ships were torn apart, pilots lost their lives, and many who had only just learned to fight gave their final breath that day. But even in loss, the humans pressed forward. For every ship destroyed, 2 more attacked. For every soldier lost, others carried their memory into the next charge. The Dravari began to retreat, not from weakness of numbers but from shock. They had never seen such a thing, an enemy who would not break. Word of the battle traveled quickly. Across the galaxy, frightened worlds listened in disbelief. The Dravari had been forced to pull back. The conquerors who seemed unstoppable had met resistance and had not claimed victory. For some, it was only a small light in the darkness, but for others, it was hope. They began to ask if perhaps surrender was not the only path. Within the council, the arguments shifted. Many still doubted, saying it was luck, saying it would not last. But others spoke differently now. They pointed to the humans and said, "They fight for all of us. If they can stand, why can't we?" The debate was far from settled, but something new had begun to grow. The Dravari had shown their strength, but the humans had shown their spirit. On Earth, the people mourned the fallen but did not despair. Names of lost soldiers were carved into stone, their stories told to children. Their sacrifice was honored not with silence but with determination. New fleets were built, new pilots trained, and new alliances forged. The first battle had not ended the war, but it had changed everything. For the Dravari, it was a lesson they did not expect. They had believed the galaxy was soft, that no one would dare resist. Now they saw that humans carried something different. It was not numbers, not technology, but something deeper. Humans smiled even in the fire of battle, not because they loved it, but because they refused to let fear control them. The first shock had been delivered. The war was far from over, but humanity had shown the galaxy that the storm could be faced. And for the first time in 3,000 years, war was no longer a forgotten word. It was real, it was here, and the humans were leading the way. After the first battle, the galaxy began to change. The Dravari, though still powerful, had been shaken. Their fleets moved more cautiously, their commanders no longer laughed at humans. Across the stars, whispers of resistance spread. Some smaller worlds began to rise, sending ships, supplies, and volunteers to join the human cause. These were worlds that had once surrendered without a fight. Now they chose to stand, inspired by what they had seen. Human leaders welcomed them. They trained new recruits quickly, sharing the lessons learned from the first battle. Farmers became soldiers, engineers became tacticians, and scholars studied enemy patterns to find weaknesses. Humans did not demand loyalty or obedience, they taught courage, discipline, and teamwork. Slowly, what had been a small fleet of brave humans became a force capable of challenging the Dravari in ways the galaxy had never imagined. The Dravari struck again, believing that their enemies were still weak and inexperienced. They sent fleets to new systems, expecting surrender. But they were met with resistance that grew stronger with every encounter. Humans and their allies fought with skill and cleverness. They set ambushes in asteroid fields, disguised their movements, and used the terrain of space to their advantage. For every Dravari ship destroyed, the humans learned something new, becoming faster, sharper, and more confident. Not all battles were victories, and losses were heavy. Ships were destroyed, lives were lost, and colonies were sometimes taken. But each loss taught humans and their allies how to improve. They studied every mistake, adapted, and became better prepared for the next attack. In time, the Dravari began to fear the unpredictability of human strategy. They had expected easy victories, but humans fought differently. They fought not for glory, not for conquest, but for survival and freedom. In the council, the mood began to shift. Representatives who had once begged for surrender now looked to humans for guidance. Some sent fleets, others offered supplies. Fear slowly turned into cautious hope. The galaxy, long unused to war, was learning again under the guidance of humanity. Small victories inspired larger ones, and slowly the tide began to turn. Humans were careful to lead with fairness. They did not conquer worlds, they did not punish those who had surrendered before. They taught others how to defend themselves, how to fight with honor, and how to remain united. Their purpose was clear: to protect the galaxy from the Dravari, not to dominate it. This made humans trusted leaders and inspired loyalty. Aliens who had once doubted them now fought at their side with courage and determination. The Dravari realized their mistakes too late. They had underestimated a species that had survived countless storms on its home planet. Humans had patience, intelligence, and an ability to inspire others. Every counterattack by humans was calculated, precise, and unexpected. Ambushes, feints, and clever maneuvers caused Dravari ships to fall one by one. They began to retreat in some areas, regrouping to plan again. The first signs of hesitation appeared among their commanders. In human fleets, the spirit of courage grew stronger. Pilots who had once been nervous now executed complex maneuvers with precision. Soldiers who had trembled before enemy fire stood firm. Engineers repaired ships quickly, and scientists improved weapons to strike harder. Communities across Earth and allied worlds worked together to ensure that the fleets were always ready. Every citizen understood their role in the fight. Every contribution mattered. The first turning point came when humans and their allies defended a vital system near the core of Council space. The Dravari had expected easy conquest, but instead they were trapped by a clever combination of strategy and courage. Human ships led the enemy into narrow fields of asteroids where their numbers became a disadvantage. Small teams of volunteers boarded enemy vessels, disabling them from within. The Dravari lost more than half their attacking fleet, forcing them to retreat in defeat. The victory spread hope across the galaxy. Worlds that had once surrendered now began to rise in rebellion. They were inspired by the humans' courage and the example of their allies. They began to train their own soldiers, build defenses, and join the fight. Slowly, humanity had not only turned the tide in battle but had awakened the courage of the galaxy. Resistance was growing, and the Dravari, once confident in total domination, now faced a galaxy that would not surrender. Through it all, humans remained calm and focused. They understood the cost of war and honored every sacrifice. They celebrated victories quietly, always remembering that the next battle would demand more courage. The galaxy had learned a lesson it had almost forgotten: even against the strongest enemy, unity, courage, and determination could turn the tide. Humanity had not only survived, they had led the way. The final battle approached. The Dravari had gathered their largest fleet, believing it would crush all resistance and finally bring the galaxy under their control. Their ships stretched across space, immense in size and power, ready to destroy any who dared oppose them. They believed victory was certain. To them, the humans were nothing more than a minor nuisance. Yet they did not know that humanity had prepared in ways the galaxy had never seen. Human fleets, though smaller, were disciplined, united, and clever. They had learned from every fight, every loss, and every victory. Their pilots flew in precise formations, their ships coordinated like a single organism. Soldiers moved with calm confidence, knowing exactly when to strike and when to defend. Engineers, scientists, and strategists worked behind the scenes, ensuring that every weapon, every shield, and every maneuver was at peak efficiency. Humanity's allies, inspired and trained, stood ready at their side. Together, they were more than a fleet, they were a force of will and courage. When the battle began, the Dravari unleashed everything they had. Their cannons roared, beams of energy tore through space, and their ships advanced like unstoppable waves. Many species watching from afar held their breath, believing that the humans and their allies would be destroyed. Yet the human fleets moved with speed and precision, dodging the enemy's heaviest strikes. Small teams of soldiers boarded enemy ships, disabling them from within, while other ships struck weak points in ways the Dravari had never imagined. The Dravari were confused and frustrated. Every plan they made was countered. Every advance met resistance. Their numbers were large, but in space, skill and strategy mattered more than size. Human commanders used clever tricks, luring Dravari ships into traps, then striking from unexpected directions. Their allies, who had once been untrained and afraid, now fought with courage and unity. Together, they became a storm the Dravari could not control. As the battle raged, human courage shone brightest in moments of greatest danger. Pilots flew through fields of debris, risking everything to save a comrade. Soldiers boarded ships twice their size, never yielding, never retreating. Engineers repaired critical systems under fire, while scientists adjusted weapons to strike harder and faster. Humanity's strength was not in the number of ships, but in the heart and spirit of those who fought. Every life mattered, and every action counted. The Dravari flagship, massive and terrifying, became the focus of the human attack. Teams of ships surrounded it, striking in coordinated waves. Pilots dodged its beams while others launched boarding parties. Within hours, the flagship's defenses began to fail. Human soldiers fought through the corridors, disabling systems, until the once powerful vessel was forced to retreat. The sight shocked the Dravari. They had never faced an enemy that would not break, that would continue to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. Across the galaxy, those watching began to hope. Worlds that had surrendered now rose in rebellion. Colonies freed from the Dravari's control joined the fight. The Council, which had once been paralyzed by fear, began to support the humans openly. Slowly, the Dravari were forced to pull back, retreating to regroup and plan. For the first time, it was clear that their conquest would not succeed. Humanity had turned the tide. On Earth and allied worlds, people celebrated cautiously. They mourned the fallen, honoring every life lost in the long struggle. Yet there was joy as well, a joy that courage, unity, and determination could overcome even the strongest enemy. Children waved to departing fleets, Elders told stories of the battle, and communities rebuilt what had been damaged. Humanity had not only survived the storm but had inspired the galaxy to rise with them. The humans smiled, but it was not a smile of pride in violence. It was a smile of understanding, a recognition of what it meant to face fear and stand firm. They had remembered their past, drawn strength from it, and used it to guide the galaxy through its darkest hour. They had fought not for glory, not for conquest, but for freedom, courage, and hope. The Dravari had returned war to the galaxy, but humanity had shown that war could be met with strength, unity, and unwavering spirit. In the end, the galaxy remembered a truth it had long forgotten. Even after 3,000 years of peace, when war returned, humans would face it with courage. They would not bow, they would not falter, and they would inspire others to do the same. The Dravari had underestimated a species that carried the memory of survival in its blood. Humanity had shown that true strength is not in weapons or numbers, but in the heart and spirit that refuses to break. The war was not over, but the hope of the galaxy had been restored. Humanity had led the way, and the other species had followed. They had learned that even in the darkest times, courage and unity could light the path. And as the humans looked toward the stars, ready for whatever came next, they smiled, knowing that they would face the future together, unbroken and unafraid.